This house is like 60% glass. To hit net zero with that much glazing, I mean, it's something that's pretty rare. That's all done through automation and circadian lighting and shades, not just energy efficiency, but let's entertain as well. How is everything set up so that's the best viewing experience for you and your guests? When you're not spending $1,000, $2,000 a month in those summer months for electrical, there's a benefit to these things that do save money over time.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Smarter Spaces podcast. I'm your host, Michael Trezza. Sustainability and luxury, can they coexist? On today's episode, we take you inside a cutting-edge net zero home to prove to you that they absolutely can exist together. Our guest is a builder who's redefining what it means to live in a high-end, energy-efficient space, from innovative materials to smart automation. We'll explore the tech and the design choices that make this home both eco-friendly and extraordinary. Don't miss it. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Smarter Spaces podcast. Today, we're diving into the world of net zero homes, where cutting-edge technology meets sustainable living. Our guest is a builder who's pushing the boundaries of what's possible, proving that energy efficiency and luxury can go hand in hand. He's been at the forefront of designing and constructing high-end self-sufficient homes, and he's here to share those innovations with us all and to show us how that all works. Let's welcome Brad Leavitt from A Finer Touch Construction to the show. Brad, how you doing?
Very good. Thanks for having me, Michael. Excited to be on.
Awesome. Thanks for doing this with us. I think we're going to have an awesome conversation surrounding a really cool project. So we're here to talk about a net zero home that was built in the desert in Arizona. This is such a cool project. It's in our Smarter Spaces magazine from the fall issue of 2023. So I know there's a lot of parties involved in this project. Can you tell us a bit about the genesis of this project? How did you get involved? And, have you been interested in sustainable buildings prior to this project?
Yeah, it's a really good, great question. I mean, we definitely, had, a strong interest in sustainable projects, especially as we see the industry moving this way. The client demand is becoming, more popular. They're becoming more aware of what's possible. We've seen that just in, the vehicle side of things now, and the housing side of things. Right. Clients are very aware. And so over the years, we had performed from a building science, looking at advanced framing, doing ICF, right, which is like insulated concrete form, building homes that are much more energy efficient. How do we insulate the foundation, which is something that's a little rare in the desert? I mean, we're fighting the heat much more than the cold, whereas right. Maybe in Canada or up north, they're fighting the cold. But, regardless is, it's something that we had never, done a net zero project before this one. And Mark La Liberté, who was our client, who had been working with Professional Builder magazine, and this was going to be their main feature for the year, the house of the year for Professional Builder. When he was looking for builders, there were a few requirements. He interviewed a lot of builders here in the Phoenix, Scottsdale area, one of which was us, of course. And he was looking for builders that had experience using some of these building science techniques and products, even if they had not done net zero. That wasn't a requirement, but he wanted someone that was somewhat familiar. And he was looking for somebody that had a platform through social media that could assist with the marketing of the project, because Mark has been a building science consultant. He was right. One of the principals at Construction Instruction, and that's now located in Denver, where they train builders and trade partners all across the country in building science. And so he's been an advocate of this for a really, really long time. And so fortunately for us is that those stars aligned. We interviewed, we had the platform, we had an interest in this. And really the whole purpose was Mark really wanted to educate the public and with Professional Builder and so many different outlets that were part of this campaign to really showcase what is possible in the desert. Because one of the things that's really unique is you think just in its principle, net zero, you're going to be living in a cave, right? All exterior walls, you're going to be protected from the sun or the right. weather. Whereas this house, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's like 60% glass, right, on the exterior, which to hit net zero with that much glazing, I mean, is something that's pretty rare.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into that as we have this conversation. We don't want to give away too much off the forefront here, but yeah. So you talked about it a little bit. Some people involved. So something that really fascinates me, are all these stakeholders that are involved in this project, right? I think that makes a unique challenge for you personally. Having to meet the needs of these various parties and everyone involved. Can you talk a little bit about, now that you got into the project, right? Talk about what the discovery process was like, assuming that you were involved in many planning stages at the onset. Did the homeowner make any requests that, seemed especially difficult on the surface? And, how did you meet those challenges?
It's a phenomenal question, Michael. I mean, the reality is, I would say just in theory, one thing that I feel our company excels at is that pre-construction process, right? And working through details. And however, we were definitely challenged on this project. And the reason I bring that up is because, to your point, there were a lot of vendors that were participating in this project, right? Whether some of this product was known to the area, whether some of the install techniques were known to the area, a lot of it was not. A lot of it was revolutionary product, being launched by some of these vendors. So there was a tremendous amount of coordination between every single component that was installed in this home. I can think of probably 15 or 16 vendors specifically that we had extensive meetings with the manufacturer, with our trades that would be installing that product to make sure it was done right, done to specifications that would hit, especially because we were doing a full YouTube series on this. We were documenting it. So we had to make sure that everything was exactly as specified by the manufacturer. So to answer that, and the client was very involved. I mean, one thing that was very unique for us is we had a full-time building consultant, Mark LaLiberte, who's in the industry, and it's his personal house that's there on site. So he's there on site performing a little bit of sweat equity. He's there directing along with our superintendent, which we loved. I mean, the reality is we received a really high education building this that has moved into, not to skip ahead too much, but fortunately, because of all the media we did with Mark, because Matt Reisinger, who some people may know, came out and did some filming with Mark and I, and through Matt's channel, which is a big channel, we have multiple net zero homes as we speak right now that were direct, referrals from that project that had seen us on YouTube, had seen on Matt's channel, had seen the push and had hired us. So really Mark's goal of pushing net zero happened here because of the documentary that we did on each process and coordinating with so many different manufacturers.
That's really interesting. It seems that Mark is such a unique person involved in this project, right? Being the end user at the same time while also being in his unique position that he's in, really obviously having a vision and being an expert in a lot of those areas versus, just having an end user being the homeowner with money who's like, I want a net zero home, make it happen for me. So I think that's a unique process in itself. Can you talk a little, so you talked about some of the parties involved. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about, the AV integrator being involved and, what was it like working with them? Were there any compromises there, challenges that you faced with that?
It's a great question. I mean, fortunately, with Crestron, we've had a relationship for probably a good 20 years. I think when I started here in Phoenix, just a brief background, I started here in 2005. And in 2006 was my first experience with Crestron on a very big project, Resort in Town. So I was very familiar with the brand, with the company, and our integrators do a phenomenal job in that coordination. So there, for what it's worth though, is there was a lot of strategy working with the integrator and with Crestron corporate as we're working through the design, because keep in mind, one thing I touched on is that 60% of this house is glass, it's glazing. And so to hit net zero, there are times of the year when that sun's really strong, and despite overhangs, despite triple pane glass, and a lot of unique building characteristics and specifications that we work from, the reality is we still had to protect the home and, through shades, and that's all done through automation and, circadian lighting and, all the different things. When you're living into the home had to mirror solstice. It had to mirror when that sun, is hitting that house from the south and the west in the summers, which people know, July, August, September, which can be really brutal here in Phoenix. We had, these shades, and we had louvers. We have these covered patio with louvers that are all integrated into the Crestron system. And so making sure that was tied in and programmed correctly and set so that the client would have very low maintenance as they lived in the home and it would self-operate. Yeah, there was a lot of coordination. I mean, not even getting into, all the other bells and whistles that come, when you automate a home, but specifically to keep that net zero energy efficiency was, we had massive shade pockets all in the great room, because the great room is all glass on both sides. And so, we really had to coordinate that at pre-con to make sure not only that everything was designed and coordinated with the truss layout, but also from the automation and wiring side.
Definitely. And don't worry, we'll get into those bells and whistles in a little bit on that side of things. But this is such a unique project, with that balance of sustainability, while you're also meeting the needs of luxury, right? And how do those two coexist? Was there ever a moment where, sustainability was taking a precedence over luxury? Was that a concern? Or, I'm sure there was a challenge of, finding that middle ground between the two.
Yeah, there can be. I think when some people think of luxury as maybe a budget item, maybe a value engineering thing. What we found with this project is there is a way to satisfy both, right? That you can still do a home. I think when most people see this build, they would look at it as an incredibly beautiful luxury home, right? Very modern architecture. I think very few people would realize it's net zero, just because you don't see a home like that that's net zero. So in
Right.
this case, because of all the coordination with the vendors who were collaborating on this project, we were able to mirror the two. I think, under normal circumstances where there was not such a push media wise, yeah, there might be a little bit more cost for the normal consumer for some of the product, right?
Sure.
And, Mark's been in the industry a long time, has a lot of relationships and people that really want, that we're pushing not only from energy efficiency, not only from net zero, but also carbon negative, right? Some of the brands are pushing the carbon negative product. There are a lot of people involved to invest in this project to make it this success that it was. So, really, to answer your question, I mean, in this is probably one of those unique circumstances that we did not have to sacrifice luxury for the benefit of sustainability.
Right, right. That's super interesting. So obviously, I'm not a builder, right? But I would imagine, there's a lot of red tape surrounding a project like this. Local legislation, do they demand any eco-friendly, aspects of this home?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how much there is a variation across the country with building standards, with code. Even in Phoenix by itself, I mean, every municipality in the Phoenix metro area, every city and town has a different code that they operate under. So us as builders, we have to be very familiar with the code, what building code they're using, and specifically with this project. Something that is very common is blow door tests, right? Looking at the ACH level of the home. You know, we have to look at, fire sprinklers in the home, right? There's certain things that are required with a building of this sort. But as far as net zero, hitting net zero from an energy efficiency aspect, that has not been a requirement of Arizona, whereas in other parts of the country, like California, new permits have to be net zero. So the net zero aspect was not, a requirement of the legislation locally. But there were, blow door tests, and there's energy efficiency, and there's lighting specifications, the based on the draw of electricity. I mean, there's things that we do have to follow where they are starting to pattern and mirror a home that's going to perform over time.
Right, right. So you talked about net zero. We've been talking about net zero. You teased it a little bit, but let's do a little bit deeper dive into the net zero and the sustainability goals, right? And can you walk us through how those goals were achieved? And one thing I find extremely fascinating is that the space has its own, so to speak, solar system and energy storage, right? That helps from my understanding, that helps keep the cooling costs basically free. Can you talk a little bit about that process and the automation involved in that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So really, as you think about net zero, for those that may not be as familiar with that term, is you're looking to create a home that over, however that's measured, maybe it's over the year, that the home is going to produce as much energy as it consumes. Now keep in mind that in Arizona, we're fighting the summer, as I mentioned. So those AC units are going to be running throughout the summer.
Right.
If you're swimming, which they do have a swimming pool at this home, so that swimming pool, the pumps are going to be running all summer. That's a heavy draw, right? And so how do you offset that heavy draw? Because solar can only capture so much, and do you have battery backup and so forth? And really, so as we looked at net zero for this project, it's you have either net zero possibly by the day or by the year, and this is like a yearly capture of net zero throughout the year. Because we can really offset a lot of that throughout the winter months. But really, as you look at construction, something that was the first time we had done, which I kind of alluded to early on, is that we insulated the slab. So we don't have any thermal break issues throughout this house, right? There's a lot of structural steel, to make sure that there's no heat transfer from outside to inside. That was a huge component. So how we worked on the stem walls, making sure that the concrete, I mentioned a lot of the walls were ICF, insulated concrete form. So we insulated the foundation underneath the slab, with 4 inches of rigid foam. Something I'd never done. We do vapor barriers, which is very common, right? For water protection. But as far as insulating the slab, so you're creating like this Yeti cooler. On the exterior walls, we worked with Fox blocks to do what's called energy sticks, and so that takes an exterior wall from maybe an R value of R22, R23 to R30, right? We did the way we did the SIPS trusses, which are structured insulated panels, that brought, our roof system to, like an R50. So you're creating this ice cream sandwich, truss system on top of your normal floor truss or like ceiling trusses where we could run electrical and low voltage and wiring and, can lights and mechanical. And then above that, we had this roof layer that was untouched. We never penetrated that. So you have this really thick, foam roof. And so there's a lot of building things we went through to your point, Michael, to create that net zero so that the home would really draw very minimal energy to perform the home itself. It could keep its temperature. It could hold its temperature. As I mentioned, any glass that was southern facing or west facing was heavily protected. It had options that if, as, our earth is rotating and that sun drops, in the summer and it kind of maybe coming directly into the house or kitchen, then you have those shades that really, reflect that heat out of the house. So all those barriers help. So then that way, as those condensers are running in the summer and the battery backup, we can store that energy and offset it.
Yeah, that's awesome. So that's really just feeding it back into the grid, to my understanding. So that's really cool. That's a really fascinating aspect of the space. So you touched upon it a little bit on the surface about some of the building materials used. And to my understanding, this is kind of the first time that these were all kind of used and designed in unison to achieve that net zero status. Things like the concrete blocks you were mentioning, insulated flooring, structural insulated panels for the roof. Can you dive a little bit more into what that all entails?
Yeah. So, I mean, really, as you're thinking about a design, keep in mind that traditional homes, are wood framed, right? And maybe 2x6, typically in a custom home, 2x8 exterior walls. And so when you're doing concrete and foam on exterior walls, the walls are thicker. So you have to plan. One thing in Scottsdale is you may own, or Desert Mountain, a lot of the desert areas that we build in the Phoenix area, you may own an acre or 2 acres of land, but your building footprint, you can only disturb maybe 30 or 40% of your envelope. And
Right.
so with that, it's state protected land. They want to keep that desert, they want to protect the environment. And so with that, you have to really understand what that layout's going to be, what the construction types are going to be, because that changes the structural components, the footings, the thickness of the walls, which can change the footprint. And, you can't build outside that envelope. So there's a lot of coordination and pre-planning with the manufacturers to know what those specs are, how they integrate, so that we can achieve the client goal of living in the home and the square footage and the layout based on, how this home will be constructed. And then, from a scheduling standpoint, how do we sequence the build? How do we stage it? This was on top of a hill, so you don't have a ton of access. So, how are we staging, getting booms and cranes in there, during the concrete pours of exterior walls and the slab itself. And so, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of coordination that happens. There's a lot of vendor participation to make sure that we're not missing something. I mentioned the thermal breaks, and as you're tying in, an insulated floating slab over a foam foundation, and then you have the exterior walls, there was just a lot of work between everyone to make sure that, we had everything accounted for.
Right. Yeah, we talked about that discovery process earlier. It sounds like, a lot of meticulous planning, sequentially how you're doing things, right? Because obviously environmental challenges are a real thing in an area like this. So can we talk a little bit about the ducting system? It's described as a plug and play system. And in the world of AV, that usually means something completely different. What exactly is that when it comes to the ducting system?
Yeah, we worked with a company called RIA, and what's unique is RIA has these like 4-inch ducts, right? That are, think of it like individual home runs, like you would have for, running electrical or
Mhm.
automation. So you kind of have your main, um, your main panel, if you will, very similar to electrical or like low voltage. You have your main hub over all the mechanicals distributed, just like you would for electrical. And we have these 4-inch ducts that run individual home runs to each of the, the vents. We had these, you know, the, they were completely integrated from a venting system, for all the return air and for all the, we look at air conditioned space, not heated space, as I mentioned. So
Right.
again, as you're running all these diffusers out there, into the great room and the bedrooms, they're all, so you would see all these little ducts, but the advantage of it, even though you have a lot of them, because each vent has, its own duct, its own home run, and there's a substantial amount. They're so small because they're 4 inches that you're able to fit a lot of stuff in a small confined space. So there was a lot of coordination. Again, this is why it's really important to get your mechanical company in first. I mean, we do that anyways, but specifically here, because there was a portion of the home from the main house to the secondary bedrooms where we did have the ICF and solid concrete walls that we had to core through to get these ducts through. And that was known, that was planned for, but regardless, you have to have the trades that are going to come back later to core through that, run these 4-inch home run ducts. But yeah, so it was a great system. RIA was a huge partner with us. And again, that ties into the automation and programming because all the mechanical is tied in so that it's all being controlled from a location.
Right. Now, is that a unique duct system? Is that frequently done, or is that unique to a space like this? How does that work?
Great question. I mean, that was the first time we had ever used that system, so it's unique to us at the time. We've only used it, I think, twice since. It's a great product, especially when you're looking at uh, really where this is important for the users. To give some context, is that because of the way that we did the SIPS panels, the trusses to hit net zero, you have an R50 roof that sits on these floor trusses. And those floor trusses, I mean, you may have, I think we had 16 inches, if I'm not mistaken, of space. And so if you're running all your fire sprinklers, your automation, your electrical, and your mechanical and plumbing, through this narrow space, and keep in mind that the exterior walls are ICF, so they're 2 inches of rigid foam and then, 8 inches
Right.
of concrete. There's not a lot of space to, vent a house. And so
Right.
traditional ducting doesn't fit. And, you can't, even rigid duct would be really difficult to put in and take up so much space. So the RIA was a great solution when you're working in a very confined space and you're trying to hit net zero, and because most of the space is being used for insulation and R value as opposed to, a highway of, all the mechanicals that typically run through there.
Right. So we talked a bit about it up front, but the climate of Arizona is obviously, a challenge with all of the glass that's in this property, right? So 700-pound panels that are triple pane, to my understanding, for the windows and the doors, in this scorching Arizona heat. Can you talk a bit about that and how it helps insulate the structures in this specific type of glass, obviously?
Yeah. So what's interesting about, to your point, at the time that we had put in the front pivot door that was 8 feet wide by 9 feet high, and then not only the pivot door, but the fixed panel just behind that you see as you walk into the home was also 8 feet by 9 feet. And at the time, those were the heaviest and largest pieces of triple pane glass that Cardinal Glass had done. I mean, so each of these pieces of glass are almost 800 pounds,
Yeah.
and so to coordinate that, and you think about how that pivot door is going to work, holding 700-800 pounds of glass.
Yeah.
The point being is that the benefit of, when you look at the U value of the rating of the glass, I mean, we were achieving, the glass was performing at the triple pane glass almost identical to what a normal 2x4 insulated wall would perform. So two
Wow.
by four insulated wall was comparable to a triple pane glass. So to have glazing that's performing at that level as if it's a 2x4 insulated wall really allowed us, to run the calculations to hit that net zero based on, where there was solid wall, and we are hitting, R30, R32 on that exterior wall. It definitely got us to where we needed to be.
Yeah, that's incredible. So, obviously not your typical sliding glass patio door here. So all
Yeah.
that glass paired with Crestron's automatic shading solutions, really enhances the efficiency, right? You talked a little bit about it earlier. It's set up to automate to lower the shades, obviously, at certain times when the sun's most scorching in that desert.
Yeah, because here's the benefit of Crestron. I mean, all of our clients, at least for me, I mean, they travel. It's very rare our clients are here for the summer. They're at a point in life where they're fortunate to have a second home, so
Right.
they're not here. So you have, ideally, especially when you have a modern home with a lot of glazing, you need to design a home around shades. You need to protect it, and you need to be able to control that through your phone, through your app. You can
Right.
control that. So all these are really imperative for the client. So our client that travels for speaking engagements a lot, when he's gone, everything's set automatically, so they don't have to worry about it. And then when they're home, yeah, they could be sitting on the couch or in their bed with their iPad or iPhone, and they can, you know, change the settings if they will while they're there. But while they're not there, everything's programmed so that they, it's lock and leave.
Right. Exactly. And I know also, with Crestron Home now, we have conditional logic, those if then sequence
Hmm.
statements. So that allows, for some of that real time data to occur where, it can react depending on what you program it to. So the goal with that is to really impact the energy usage and the climate of the home. Like you said, like if they're not there for the 3 months in the summer, then they're not worrying about increased energy costs when they're not even utilizing the home. So that's really cool. So, we've been talking about the sun and the climate since it's obviously located in the desert. Can you talk about the actual, building orientation and how that plays a role?
Yeah, that's another great question. This is something not only for this project, but I think every home that we built in Arizona, we, every architect we work with, we take a lot of coordination. There's a lot of planning based on the orientation in the home. Um, Something as small as how the clients live. And I'll give one example, just even outside the house. Almost every home that we built has a swimming pool, right? That's just something you do in Arizona. And it's really important for the client that, hey, do we want, ideally, if the client wants to have sun on them all the time or sun over the pool, then the pool has to be on the south side of the home. If the client wants a lot of shade in their pool because they don't want sun on their face and they don't mind being in the shade, then the pool's on the north side. So even the layout of the landscape really depends on how the client's going to use the property. And then everything is built around that, right? So the house, the front door, I ideally don't have front door facing west or south because in those summer months that door just gets beat, right? And
Just
especially if you have
blast
a
it. Yeah.
glass door, yeah, if you have a glass door
Right.
or a wood door for that matter, right? It just takes a beating all summer. And so, anywhere that's facing west, we heavily protect, whether it be overhangs, whether it be, as we talked about, shades, whether it be the materials that we put on the exterior of the building. We're very mindset, even from the patio, the finishes we put on the decking so kids don't burn their feet as they're walking out to the pool. So everything's coordinated from finishes, from exterior substrates to the layout of the house to make sure, hey, who's going to be using the home the most? If these are empty nesters, we want to make sure that the master bedroom, and that suite's on the east side of the home where it may see the sun in the morning, but by noon it's overhead and it's gone. And that way in the late afternoons and evenings, that sun's not beating on the master bedroom or the kitchen or great room where they're entertaining. So yeah, to your point, this house, as well as every home, is heavily coordinated based on, the layout and solstice.
Right. So how is paint involved in a space like this? Can you talk about some of the paint and other materials that you would normally find in a home, and how they're designed to be eco-friendly compared to, obviously standard?
Yeah, and this really is a question, as we look at, VOC content, right, and off gassing. I mean, this is something that's become much more prevalent for our clients. And, there's companies such as Delos, which I know integrate,
Yep.
where they are tracking, those VOC content in the air from not just from paint, but from cabinetry finish, from staining in the home, from doors that have been stained offsite, brought into the house, furniture that's brought in. So this is a common question. And so depending on where the client's at, we do have a lot of options, like I mentioned, with companies that are out there that integrate with Crestron, that can really control the air in the home. And that goes back to the earlier question, doing an ERV, right? In the home and working, which is very common for us to work through, a mechanical system that is bringing in natural airs as it should, that it is offset from, depending on how big the hood's going to be or the fireplace is. So creating that balance of the home. So that way the clients are living in a healthy environment.
Yeah, so with these low VOC paints, that ensures the building is, watertight to my understanding, right? So that prevents, I don't know how much of a concern this is in the desert of Arizona, but under normal circumstances, it would prevent dampness, for mold concerns and things like that. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, and that's a big part. I mean, this has become much more of an ask, especially since COVID and the pandemic. We've seen people become very aware, hyper aware of the water that they drink, the air that they breathe. And so, not only from, as you mentioned, the VOC, which you touched on with paint and the fumes that, off gas over time, but also the water they drink. And so, we have a lot of clients that are looking at, the water tables and we do testing on that. And then we're designing water filtration systems around that again are tied into the automation system.
Right. So the home's, watertight, like we just talked about. It's also airtight. So why are both important in this climate? Specifically in regards to this desert air. You talked about, the health consciousness of, everyone nowadays with your filtration, basically. So I would imagine that, some bugs and there's some weather concerns. Are there any concerns about a home like this being, too tight in terms of airtight, watertight, as in without like the right air exchange?
Well, it's a great question, Michael. I think there's this, I don't want to say misnomer, but I think a lot of us are like, you don't want your house too tight, it needs to breathe, all these things we've heard over years, right? And this is Mark La Liberté. I've been around him enough and hear him speak. And what's funny is he gives a few analogies. I mean, one, it's kind of if you're outside in Minnesota in the winter and you have this amazing, down jacket on that's going to keep you warm. Well, if you have the zippers down in the front, what good does that do, right? All that cold air is coming in. You need that zipped up tight. The whole point is to control, right, that airflow. You can control moisture and airflow and moisture content and so forth. The other comment he makes, he says, when you're in a home, how many of you are continuous breathers, right? And I just always laugh when he says it. We all are, right? And so there's going to be humidity and moisture in that house, and so the whole point is you want the home as tight as can be, and then you want to control that through fresh air intake that comes into the home. You want to control through the mechanical system. So yeah, the reality is you want as tight a home as you can. You want to control all the moisture you can. You want to control all the water, because that is our biggest enemy as a builder. And then with that, through the system, from an internal side, you're controlling and understand the humidity and the moisture and everything else through fresh air, and how that mechanical system is designed. So yeah, this is a huge part of this house, and this home is extremely tight. And that's where like aero barrier, a lot of people that know the aero barrier product, where you come in and just before drywall, it spins around these really small little particles that enclose and seal the entire home. And that's something we've done on many projects, because now you're creating a home that's completely tight, air sealed, and we can control everything as we'd want in a perfect, I don't want to say perfect, in an environment that we feel we can control.
Right. Yeah, that's really fascinating. So you're making it airtight and watertight, and then you're really just, optimizing it from there and maintaining it. So, you're setting that environment essentially. That's really cool to know. So I'm sure there's other energy saving technologies in the house. You talked about it, about the circadian lighting and things like that. Lighting, occupancy sensors. I'm sure these technologies, help and solve things like vampire draws, right? We're being really energy conscious in a home like this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the energy side is really important. I mean, what's nice is they have, there's all the sensories and boundaries, in the sense that, you come into a home, and if your phone's on, you kind of touch on this, Michael, that if you're out of town and you show up and it can sense that, hey, Brad's in the house or Mark's in the house, because we're picking up that his phone's there. So he's moving around, and it can understand your living, how you live, so that not everything's turning on. And so to that point, yeah, we're making sure that, the way the house is programmed, yes, you could come in and hit all on, and it'll have some certain areas that are targeted, maybe the great room, maybe the kitchen, maybe the hallway leading to the master bath. And so we've pre-programmed settings where it doesn't turn the whole house on, right? But you could turn the whole house off. And, so controlling lighting, looking how we did, the water heater, solar power water heaters that are there, the pool system, how that's tied in, because this one thing that's unique about this build is the HOA requires them to have a cover over their pool. And that's to mitigate evaporation in the summer. And so again, that uses energy, right? So how do you offset that? And so all these things are coordinated, well in advance. But yeah, what's fortunate for us is technology's come a long way. And with the automation side, things can be programmed based on how the client's going to live in that home.
Right, 100%. I mean, as we all know, a lot of times, even things like basic home air conditioning, right? Multi zones. Like, unfortunately, my home only has one zone of AC. But as we know, when you're sleeping at night, you're only in a small portion of the house. So it's really about the way you live and accommodating that by using, only energy, when possible.
Yeah. Why run if you have five? Yeah, a home like this, if you have five condensers, you probably have to run one at night. The other four can run, but maybe they're keeping it 82 degrees in other parts of the house as opposed
Right.
to 71. So it does you can set that up so you're optimizing the energy efficiency. So
Right. And that automation is taking it a step further and really adapting to the way you're living. And then, obviously setting it to, things like quick actions, like you mentioned, to be able to turn on only certain portions and have, everything automate to your lifestyle, which is really cool. So what's a house like this without some entertainment? What's the entertainment system like in this home?
yeah, you have to have entertainment. And so, from some sunken fireplaces outside with the TV to the TV in the great room, of course, um, uh, even, to the bathroom itself, right? From the mirrors, lighted mirrors and music, Kohler, it was a partner of ours in this, and they've really gone a long way to make, your bathroom like a spa experience. And so
Right.
just from, sound, throughout the home, the speakers that are throughout the home, the TVs and entertainment, everything has its place. So as the clients are getting ready, they have, an outdoor shower, they can listen to music, now, and with the Anthem digital shower, everything's programmed to his and hers, how they like it in that car
Right.
wash that we
Yeah.
tease them on, because there's so many fixtures in there.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, but the reality is, that's a big part of it is not just energy efficiency, but let's entertain as well. And when you entertain a lot, how is everything formatted and set up so that's the best optimal viewing experience for you and your guest?
For sure. From the moment that you have a guest walk up to your front door, through the house to the outside, a consistent entertainment experience, which is really cool. So I find this next question I'm about to ask very interesting. What are some other luxury touches in the home that you might not normally associate with sustainability?
Yeah, that's another good question. I mean, something that we are a fan of from the fabrication standpoint, right? We don't have sinks in the home because all the countertops were integrated. And so our fabricator had built all the sinks out of the countertop material. The drains were built in there. So you look at these, it's a very modern design. And so again, you know, floating cabinetry with LED underlighting. And so from from the cabinetry to some of the finishes to um, the TNG ceilings all throughout the home. There's just a lot of warm features that bring in a lot of warmth into a home like this. It's very modern, and a lot of people may think as modern as being cold, but when you add wood, it can make it very warm. And so, from the appliance standpoint to the very large butler's pantry behind it, even in this isn't a huge home. We also did the casita, which is, a ready frame. So that came out, we didn't have to stick frame that in the field. That came ready frame, ready to go. And again, that, as you look at just some of the finishes that, that people see, the fireplace details, there's some really neat aspects to that design that really give it that luxury feel that really had nothing to do with net zero. It just makes it look very beautiful and livable when you're in there.
Right. While also meeting, the sustainability goals that you're looking to accomplish. So it seems that, obviously this is a very extensive project with things like designers, architects, consultants, and obviously you being the builder involved. I would imagine that, on the surface, this would cost considerably more, than a standard build up front. Right. But what I wanted to bring to the surface here was the longevity and the homeowner's investment and future cost savings with a project like this. So in addition to, the environmental benefits that we're talking about here, what kind of cash savings can a home like this create? Can you talk a little bit about the net zero nature of this project in terms of, the costs associated and how these costs might be offset in areas?
It's a great question, Michael. And I think, when you look at health, I mean, what's the price of health, right? I think
Right.
until you don't have good health, what's the price? And what I mean by that is we touched on this with the VOC. So how you control off gassing, healthy water, healthy breathing, that's one in itself. As you think it just costs for like running a home over time. Yeah. You do a project of this magnitude that's net zero. Yeah. It could cost you 20, 25% more than maybe a build without all these different features, and sustainable aspects. But over time, especially if you're going to live in that home and keep that, not only from a health perspective, but also from a payback, when you're hitting net zero and you don't have utilities and you're not spending, which some people could spend $800, $1,000, $2,000 a month in those summer months for electrical, right?
Right.
And you're protected from the grid. I mean, even outside of just the savings of the normal utilities and day-to-day living, think about, a city like Arizona where we have a lot of people moving here. It's one of the biggest cities in the country. Um, it's very common to have power outages in the summer. And so
Yep.
if you have solar, this is a luxury item with the battery backup. Yes, solar in itself cannot be offset over time. You can maybe 6, 7, 8 years that can pay for itself, but the batteries add a little bit more cost. But again, you have the savings that if you have a wine cellar, if and you have
Peace of
excessive
mind.
wine, yeah, if you have
Yeah.
a freezer and you have some steaks in there, or you've been hunting,
Right.
right, that you don't want to go bad. I
Yeah.
mean, there's a benefit to these things that
Yeah.
do save money over time.
Yeah. It's not one to one in that aspect. Like you mentioned,
Yeah,
health is wealth, right? So that's a really
health is
unique
wealth,
perspective
and there's
from it.
convenience. There's a cost for convenience too.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, which, a lot of people, including myself, are willing to pay up for, right? So, my final question for you today is, how has work on this home impacted your business? Has it led to similar projects? What knowledge from this have you taken to those projects as a result on your work on this building?
Yeah, I don't think I really grasped or fully understood the benefit this project would be. I mean, it was an investment from us, just being open. I knew going into it, just like our vendors were being asked. We as a builder were as well. But the benefit is, as I mentioned, I have 3 projects right now that are incredible projects that were all directly related to this project. All 3 of these clients had seen the YouTube content, reached out specifically. One in particular is one of our most signature projects we've built to date. And the client found us through that YouTube channel and called me directly and said, Brad, we didn't realize there's a builder that's building to this level and scale in Arizona. You're going to build our house and we want it net zero. And having gone through this as we're working through these details, and again, even outside of the business development arm and people that have known us by doing net zero, and so many of our clients are asking for sustainable. We just finished a home um, 2 months ago that almost every feature that we put in this net zero home, they put in their home. So again, we have experience there. But just outside of that, I mean, you look at I'm doing my personal house, and we have a lot of those characteristics in my house, and it's really educated our team to realize we can be challenged, and it's put us in a
Right.
place where, yeah, we know we can perform, and our client base knows we can as well.
That's incredible. Brad, thank you so much for joining. This has been a blast. I can't thank you enough for hopping on. That's a wrap for this episode of the Smarter Spaces podcast. Brad, again, huge thank you for joining. I really enjoyed this conversation today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Michael. It was a pleasure.
Of course. So thank you everyone for joining us on this journey in the future of smart and sustainable homes. If you really enjoyed this conversation, be sure to subscribe to the Smarter Spaces podcast on all major platforms. You can find more episodes and podcasts and insights at crestron.com/smarter spaces. Until next time, thanks for listening.